G'day guys and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we are going to be installing an aftermarket exhaust onto my 200 series Landcruiser. So today we're going to be going over what exhaust I've chosen, a little bit about why I've chosen this particular exhaust, and a step-by-step instruction on how to remove your old exhaust and install a new one onto your car. So stay tuned and let's get into today's video. Okay guys, so let's start with what exhaust I've chosen for the 200 series Landcruiser before we move on to the installation. So here we have our aftermarket exhaust laid down here on the garage. So I've chosen to go with a MANTA system. So MANTA is a company in regional WA in Cunderdin, and they make high quality exhaust for a huge variety of four-wheel drives and passenger vehicles. So one of the prime reasons I went for this is just that quality and the name, renowned name, and positive review that I've heard from MANTA themselves. Now when you have a look at MANTA, there are heaps of different options, in particular for the 200 series Landcruiser. I believe there's over 25 different options when you can include all the different configurations, noise levels, diameters and materials for the 200 series Landcruiser. So there is a huge amount of choice when selecting your exhaust. So I've chosen to go for this system behind me here, and we'll go over each part and I'll go over what it is, how it works and why I've chosen it. So starting up the top end at the engine side of the exhaust, we have twin 3-inch dump pipes. Now they're just those short stubby pipes up the end, and they're just fairly stock standard for the 200 series Landcruiser. Obviously they come out of the back of the turbo and into the rest of the exhaust. So following that we have two straight pipes. This is going to be one from each bank of the V8, and in those I've chosen to go for high flow cats. This just keeps the system legal and it's not really going to impede on any power or exhaust note tones. Coming past there, we then go into our center muffler. So you can see those two pipes then come into one central muffler in the center of the system there. And this is where the system then expands from that 3-inch size up to the 4-inch. Moving down to the end of the system, we have that single 4-inch twisted pipe here. And that's the section that's going to go over the rear axle and around that back section of the car, and then into the single 4-inch section that will be the tailpipe of the vehicle. And you can see there at the end, you've got that small few inches at the end of polished steel, just to make it look a little bit nicer coming out the back end of the vehicle. So like I mentioned, this is a fairly stock standard system for MANTA for the 200 series. If you jump on the website and choose a turbo back with cats, 3-inch dual into 4-inch single exit, medium noise level and aluminized seal, you're going to get the same system that I'm using today. If you pop over to the MPI Automotive website, the dealer for MANTA, you'll be able to see a full component breakdown of all the parts listed in today's video for my exhaust system. Now the reason I've chosen this particular system is I wanted something with a little bit of a V8 note behind it, but not something that's going to be too loud, and I still want it to remain legal as well. So this system here is fully legal, fully ADR compliant, but it's also going to give this V8 that we have in a Landcruiser a little bit of a nice note, give it a bit of a rumble, and when I put my foot down we should be able to hear that, that engine liven up a little bit. One thing I had to keep in mind is that we are going to be towing for significant periods of time, and I don't want that drone that sometimes comes with aftermarket exhausts. So this is something I'm going to be testing out with this particular exhaust. Hopefully that center muffler there is going to be appropriate and keeping that drone down and keep the volume at a nice reasonable level, still with a little bit of bark when you put your foot down. So we're going to get on to removing the old system now from the Landcruiser, and then we're going to go through bit by bit about how to install one of these on your car, in your garage, at home yourself. So let's get straight onto that. So I just want to start by saying that I'm not a mechanic. I don't have much in terms of a mechanical background. I have done some research into how to install this exhaust, and I know the sort of theory behind it. However, obviously this video is going to be a bit of a guide in relation to how you can do it at home yourself in a similar position that I am. So from what I've researched, the best way to do this is to dismantle the old system from back to front, just removing each piece as you go along. Now I have soaked all the bolts underneath the vehicle in WD-40, as I know they're going to be a little bit stiff, and I also know from research that the dump pipe bolts that are attached to the back of the turbo or can potentially cause a bit of an issue, as they're going to be nice and stiff and hard to get off, and they're also a little bit inaccessible. So what I'm going to do first up is going to lift the front of the car up, put it onto axle stands just to give a little bit more room underneath the vehicle to work. I'm also going to remove these front wheels, as I do believe we should be able to access one or two of the dump pipe bolts from the side of the vehicle. Removing these wheels is just going to give us a little bit more access around that area. So let's get this car lifted up, remove these wheels and get started. In addition to removing the front wheels, we're also going to need to remove the spare wheel from underneath the rear of the vehicle. And this is going to give us access to that rear section of the exhaust. So in front of the rear axle of the vehicle is a small metal clamp that's going to be holding the tailpipe onto the rest of the system. Removing one bolt from this clamp and sliding it off will allow us to remove that last bit of the tailpipe from the factory system. Once you have that clamp removed, it's now a matter of removing the tailpipe of the exhaust from the rubber hangers that it sits onto at the rear of the vehicle. Now these rubber hangers sit between a bracket connected to the chassis rail or the vehicle and a bracket connected to the exhaust system, and this just allows for a little bit of flex while the vehicle's in motion and while the exhaust pipe is moving around. You can also use a bit of WD-40 to lubricate those hangers and allow the rubber to slide off easily. On the tailpipe of this vehicle, there are 2 rubber hangers that can be removed, and this will allow access to remove the rear tailpipe of the factory system. So moving forward, we come to where the 2 straight pipes meet into the single center muffler. Now initially I just gave it a go with a normal ratchet to see how tight these bolts were. However, I soon figured out that we're going to be needing more than just a basic ratchet. So I then gave the impact driver a go, however there still wasn't enough to free these bolts. The technique I discovered that worked the best for this dismantle was using a breaker bar to crack the bolts loose, to get them spinning just a couple of turns, and then you could either use a normal ratchet or an impact driver to finish them off. The only difficulty here is that obviously a breaker bar with its extended reach is going to prove a little bit difficult to gain access to some of the areas. Now another hot tip for dismantling these systems, due to the fact that the bolts are so stiff, you're going to be wanting to use a 6.14mm socket rather than a standard or more common 12-point socket. Now what I mean by that is the socket itself is the shape of the head of the bolt rather than a 12-point socket which has the ability to fit onto bolts from multiple angles. Having a 6-point socket will make it a little bit more difficult to access the areas, as you will have to align the head of the bolt up with that socket each time, particularly with a breaker bar where you can't use a ratcheting function. However, it's something that you really want to try to make work just to reduce that risk of stripping the bolts. Now there are 3 rubber hangers on this particular section, one for each of the front pipes and one towards the rear of the muffler as well. So just like the rear of the exhaust, it's a matter of prying these off. Now I find a good way to do that was just using a long flathead screwdriver and then prying them off that way. They can be a little bit difficult as there is a bit of a head to the bracket which the rubber has to slide over, but once it's over the end it's quite simple to slide off the rest of the way. So again, moving forward, we're now moving onto the 2 bolts that hold the straight pipes onto the back of the dump pipes. Now obviously there's going to be one on each side and they're both going to be exactly the same. So the same technique as we used before, using a breaker bar to crack the tension on the bolts and then using either an impact driver or a ratchet to finish the bolts the rest of the way. So you can see from this point in the video, there's a bit of liquid hanging around this section of the exhaust, and this is just some of the excess WD-40 that I used to try and penetrate those bolts a few hours before dismantling. Okay, so we're just in the front fender at the moment, and this is that piece of plastic that protects the engine bay from the wheels. So we just need to remove this piece of plastic here. Now you're going to be coming across a couple of different types of clips that Toyota have used to fasten this bit of plastic. The top 3, the one up here, middle and the lower of the top ones, are going to be these little white clips here. So these little ones here do have 2 little prongs that you sort of have to squeeze in from the back. I've actually been using a screwdriver to get in from the front, just pull them down a little bit and poke them out. So that's one of them there, and a second one that holds this lower section down to the chassis rail is one of these larger black style clips. You just got to pry the middle section up and out, and then you'll be able to pull out the clip from the chassis rail. So it always is a good idea, and what I've done in this case is just gone down to Toyota and bought a few more of these clips. I was missing a couple anyway, and already from the other side one of these white ones has disintegrated when trying to remove them. So it's a good idea to have some of them spare on hand, just so when you go to put the car back together you have all the components you need. So we'll get these last 2 out and remove this piece of plastic here. So once that bit's taken off there on both sides, you'll be able to see access to your turbo back bolt. So one of them's right here. We'll do a close-up in just a moment. This here is an aftermarket piece as well. This is the hose for my oil catch can. So if you don't have one of those, this piece won't be here, but you will note you've got your, you have got some hard lines here, some electrical cables and some brake lines as well. So it's limited access in here, but it does help to get those sides off, just to get those rear access there. Okay, so this is the fun part of the install where it's going to be a little bit difficult to access these bolts. So I thought I'd start with the outer bolt, the one closest to the chassis rail here, which is going to be the easiest, and try and loosen off those other bolts with the breaker bar. Now access here is difficult, and using a combination of swivel adaptions, the different sized extensions and different types of ratchets and breaker bars, you will eventually get them all loose and get them all through. This is going to take some time, and that limited access really does prove to be a little bit difficult there in terms of effective and quick dismantle. Now using a ratchet I did find was the best option. However, again, due to that limited space, it is going to take you some time, as you're only going to get a fraction of a turn each time you action that ratchet. So just be patient, use the combination of whatever's necessary to get those bolts off. Just be very, very careful not to strip those bolts, and take your time. Now for the lower bolt, I did have to use a series of extensions and an angled adapter just to get access to it, and then using a breaker bar followed by a ratchet, it is possible to do from underneath the vehicle. Now due to the fact that it's going to be identical, I'm not going to show the other side being removed. However, it is exactly the same. Using a combination of ratchets, extensions and swivels, you will eventually get those bolts cracked free. Just take your time and make sure not to strip those heads. Okay, so there we have it. Old exhaust is now out, new exhaust is ready to go in. But while they're both here on the floor, we can do a bit of a comparison and see side by side some of the differences and some of the advantages of fitting a larger upgraded aftermarket exhaust. So those dump pipes were a bit of a pain to get out. The access to the bolts that hold onto the back of the turbo actually aren't too hard to get to. To be honest, the hardest part I found were the small little bolts just holding the end of the dump pipe onto a bracket. So there's one on each dump pipe that hold a bracket at the end of the dump pipe to the side of the engine there. They were quite difficult just due to the access. You can't use a breaker bar or anything like that. So you had to use a spanner, and there's quite a bit of pressure required to get them off. Dump pipe bolts, so after a couple of hours of soaking in WD-40, breaker bar, crack them straight up, and then you can just use a normal ratchet to get them the rest of the way. In terms of all the rear half of the exhaust, it's all fairly simple. Again, just using a breaker bar to crack the tension, and then using either the rattle gun there, or just using a normal ratchet to finish them off. But having them side by side here, you can really see the differences. So starting with the dump pipes here, we can see just the diameter of those pipes there. There's quite a large difference in there, plus also the bends as well. You'll see these dump pipes are quite straight in their flow design. However, these aftermarket ones, these factory ones here, have quite a bend here, which causes a little bit of restriction, plus a few access points for those bolts. So just a little bit of design there. Again, the aftermarket one, it's a little bit better design in terms of high flow exhaust passing through. Moving on to the straight pipes, you can see there, obviously fairly similar. Again, the diameter is just quite a bit larger, and the catalytic converters are fairly significantly smaller on the aftermarket exhaust. Again, with the center muffler on the vehicle, the aftermarket exhaust has a much reduced sized center muffler there, and just again, obviously those pipes are smaller in diameter. In the tailpipe though, moving to the 4-inch on the aftermarket system, that's where you really notice a huge increase in the size of the pipes. Those two sections of the aftermarket exhaust really do have a huge diameter in comparison to the factory one. And also with the factory one, I have noticed a small little crimp or a squash mark in the exhaust there. So that's definitely going to be slowing down and impeding the airflow coming out of the exhaust. Just another reason to upgrade and put an aftermarket high quality exhaust in. So overall, so far it's been fairly straightforward. It's probably taken about an hour and a half to remove the old exhaust. It's not too difficult, definitely not as difficult as some people make it out to be on the forums and whatnot. So now it's just a matter of doing the reverse. So we're going to be sticking the dump pipes back on first at the front of the system. We're going to put those dump pipe bolts nice and tight, and then we're just going to work our way backwards, installing each piece at a time. When I do install those pieces, we do get gaskets and all the required hardware with the kit, but we're just going to leave the bolts loose and just put it together loose so it all sits there. Once it's all in place on its hangers and sitting there, then we can go from front to back and tighten them all the way up. So let's get back to the vehicle, start installing these aftermarket dump pipes. Reinstalling the new exhaust is very much similar to dismantling the old one, just in reverse. So we're going to start at the front with this dump pipe here, sliding it onto the bolts, and then just hand tightening the nuts as far as you can go. Now I found with the aftermarket exhaust it was much easier to get an extension to tighten the two top bolts from underneath the vehicle. However, the bottom bolt there didn't quite have enough access for the swivel adaptation, and therefore I had to tighten that from the top. Now also, given its placement and the shape of the new dump pipe, it also was hard to fit a ratchet in there, so the only thing I could do was use a manual spanner just to turn the bolt a fraction at a time. So just take your time while doing this bottom bolt up, get it nice and firm, and then evenly tighten each of the bolts down together, making sure there's a nice even compression on the back of that turbo. So this is where the process becomes a little bit easier. It's just a matter of finding out which straight pipe goes on which side, lining up the bolts, placing in a gasket, and then hand tightening the nuts. Like I said, I'm leaving the system nice and loose until it's all in place and on its hangers. Once it's in place and ready to go, I'll then tighten front to back. So we lift the center muffler up into place, put it onto its hangers, and make sure it's sitting there nice and securely. We can then tighten the bolts onto those front straight pipes we just installed, and then move on to the tailpipe section. So one of the differences here with the aftermarket exhaust is the tailpipe is split into two sections. You've got this sort of twisted pipe here which is designed to go over the rear axle, and this bolts on with a 4-bolt flange onto the rear of the center muffler. Just like the rest of them, inserting that gasket and then hand tightening the nuts ready for the final installation. So moving down to the back for the last bit of the tailpipe, again as before, we're reusing the original factory rubber hangers, putting the tailpipe onto the hangers, and then inserting the rear section of the exhaust like a sleeve over that twisted section from the rear axle. So once that tailpipe is then slid onto the section that goes over the rear axle, you can then tighten the bolt for the sleeve, which will then create a seal and tighten the two parts together. Once the system is secure, it's then time to go from front to back to make sure all the bolts are nice and tight. So the final stage of the install is just to make sure that we reinstall those plastic guards in the fender wells and then put our front tyres back on, removing the vehicle from axle stands, and we are ready to go. There we have it, guys. The exhaust is finished. It's all fully installed and ready to go. So it probably took us about 3 hours in total to get rid of that old exhaust and install a new one. But it looks really, really good. It all fitted very, very well, and my initial impressions of the install and the quality of the product is great. Nothing went wrong during the install. Everything lined up as it should, and everything looks to be of great quality. Now, I'm not going to play too much of the footage in relation to how it sounds now with the new exhaust on, because I am going to dedicate a video to my thoughts on this exhaust and some of the sound comparisons with the old exhaust and the new exhaust in different scenarios. But overall, I've done already 2,500 kilometers on a 4-wheel drive trip with this exhaust installed, and I am really impressed with the quality, the sound, and just the general fitment of the product itself. So I'll leave a couple of clips in here of the exhaust on that trip, just some of the notes we got from some heavy acceleration. But do stay tuned for that video in the future, where I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison with the old exhaust and my thoughts on how this exhaust sounds from inside the cab on long drives and varying 4-wheel drive scenarios. So guys, I hope this video has helped you out a little bit and given you a bit of an idea of what to expect if you are planning on installing an aftermarket exhaust on your Landcruiser 200 series, whether or not it be a product by MANTA or not. So look guys, just a couple of tools you will need. I definitely recommend getting some of those extra clips from Toyota. They are probably going to break on those plastic fenders inside the wheel wells. Really highly recommend a 6.14mm socket as well. That's really going to help you reduce the risk of stripping their heads of the bolts, and things like a breaker bar, various extensions and swivel adaptions as well. It's just going to make your life a whole lot easier when trying to get to those dump pipe bolts and some of the other hard to reach or awkward bolts in the vehicle. But guys, I hope this has helped you out a little bit. Hope it's given you a bit of an idea of what to expect, and good luck if you are planning on installing your own exhaust. But stay tuned. In the next couple of weeks, I'll release a video of a side-by-side comparison, and we'll see you in that video. Cheers, guys.